into a homosexual relationship with her father in order to have access to Jan. I had a fixation for Jan. I didn't know why, but I did. And I wanted to be around her.
Hello everyone, welcome to my true crime deep dive. Today we are discussing the case of Jan Broberg, a young girl who was abducted, SAed, and brainwashed, not once but twice, by a sick predator who also groomed and manipulated Jan's parents in order to get close to their daughter. This case takes place during the 1970s, where we didn't know everything that we know today, but let this case be a reminder that predators are more likely to be a known family member, friend, or coworker than just some random person off the street. If you don't know me, I'm Sarah. I'm a certified coach specializing in abuse recovery from narcissistic, sociopathic, and psychopathic abuse. Before we dive into this case, let's break down who is involved with this case. So first of all, we have the Brobergs. We have Bob Broberg, the father of Jan. He owns a flower shop. Marianne Broberg, Jan's mother, and their oldest daughter, of course, Jan. Then we have Karen, who is 2 years younger than Jan, and Susan, who is 4 years younger than Jan. Then we have the Berchtolds. We have Robert B. Berchtold, who is the predator in this case. He is a businessman and very involved in the church. Then we have Gail. That is Robert Berchtold's wife. And then together they have 5 children, 4 boys and 1 girl. And these boys are similar in age to Jan and her 2 sisters. And lastly, we have Joe Berchtold, who is the brother of Robert Berchtold. In 1972, Marianne Broberg met Robert Berchtold, who I will now be referring to as B, and his family at a religious service. B was involved with the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the LDS Church, and Marianne worked at her church. So Marianne introduced B to her family, and that was when the manipulation started. B left a love bombing gift, a fruit basket with a card that read, quote, "We sure enjoy your family, the Berchtolds," end quote. This first impression left the Brobergs to believe that B was a kind man, and the wonderful start led to the Berchtolds and Brobergs to become fast friends. Jan even has said that she viewed B as a second father figure, and B was frequently at the Broberg home. The 2 families almost seemed like one, as the kids had frequent sleepovers and outings together. This friendship was a cover-up for B's disgusting interest in Jan, as he showered Jan with attention, gifts, and spent a lot of time with her unsupervised. In the fall of 1972, B decided to get closer to Marianne. He started calling Marianne and asking her to bring him lunch. Marianne did bring him lunch, and B eventually got her to agree to attend an LDS church outing with him. And during that trip, B and Marianne were physically intimate. B didn't stop there. Around the same time, B and Bob took a car ride together. Bob has explained the situation on the Netflix documentary Abducted in Plain Sight, that B was complaining that he wasn't intimate with his wife Gail, and they were having marriage problems. And at the time, B was actually physically aroused, and he asked Bob to relieve him. And Bob ended up feeling bad for B and reached over and relieved him after B convinced him that relieving him was just kid stuff. B was using all of this intimacy to set up blackmailing for the Broberg parents. B knew exactly what he was doing. He knew if he had dirt on the Brobergs, he would have a higher chance of getting what he wanted. And he was right. In January 1974, B actually was rebuked by the LDS Church because he had an inappropriate relationship with a young girl. After he was rebuked, B told the Brobergs that he was SAed by his aunt when he was only 4 years old, and in order for him to heal, he needed to sleep in the same bed as Jan, as he listened to tapes that his therapist provided for him. Bob and Marianne have said that they didn't like it, but they let B carry out his falsified therapy sessions in Jan's bed 4 times a week for 6 months. 6 months of this. This so-called therapist had his license revoked and was illegally aiding B in the grooming of Jan. Jan actually recalls being unsupervised with B a few times during these sessions. I don't know how anyone in the right mind could ever allow someone like B in their child's bed, especially after he was rebuked from their church for having an inappropriate relationship with a young girl. I wouldn't care if a therapist said it was part of someone's therapy. My child would come first. I do understand that B is very convincing, charismatic, charming, and manipulative, but I don't see how any parent would think that this is okay. They did say that they felt apprehensive about it, but the fact of the matter is that they let it happen. They didn't go and ask questions. They didn't say, okay, what's your therapist's number? Like, let me talk to someone else. Maybe they'd be like, oh, I'm going to talk to the authorities. I've never heard of something like this. It was a different time, is what everyone keeps saying. So I just don't see it. So this was a huge red flag. And B was really testing how far he could really go with being with Jan. B wanted to see how many boundaries he could cross, and this family just opened a gate for him. On October 17th, 1974, Thursday, after a lot of convincing, Marianne allowed B to take Jan horseback riding after Jan's piano lessons, but warned B to have Jan home before Bob came home for dinner. So B picked up Jan from piano lessons and pretended to take her horseback riding. And he ended up giving Jan an allergy pill, which was most likely a sleeping pill. So after Jan was asleep, he drove them to a predetermined site where B then punched out his own window of his car, where his hand was all bloody, and he staged a scene to make it look like both he and Jan were taken against their will. So B then carried Jan to the motorhome that he had previously set up and continued to drive to a different location. And B laid down and made it look like he was in the same state as Jan, so the situation would be even more believable and his plan would be successful. When Jan woke up, she was confused and disoriented. The first thing Jan saw was a white device-like speaker next to her bed. So that actually had a message from aliens named Zeta and Zethra. That message stated that Jan was half alien, that her mother was her real mother, but her father was not a real father. And her real father was an alien. Zeta and Zethra had a task for Jan, and that was for Jan to have a baby before her 16th birthday with her male companion to save the planet. If she failed to do that, her sister Susan would have to take her place, because they said Susan was also half alien, but Karen, her other sister, would go blind because she's fully Bob's child, that she's not an alien like Jan and Susan. And then her father would no longer be alive, and Jan would be vaporized. How messed up is that? Obviously, Jan immediately knew that the male companion was B. She was worried he was unconscious when she found him in the motor home, and she explained everything to B. Before everyone goes into this isn't believable mode, the only reason Jan is manipulated by this is because the whole situation was confirmed by B. He was her second father figure and an important person in her life. She woke up in this situation where another person is going along with the aliens, the whole male companion, and we have to remember that she is 12, and she wasn't really exposed to anything like this before. There was no internet. All she had to believe was the sick man. And during this time, there were a lot of UFO sightings and talking about aliens going on in the newspapers, on TV. So she was already aware of this could be a possibility. She had that imagination already sparked within her. While Jan is missing, Marianne and Bob are worried and want to call the police. But Gail, B's wife, declares that they should wait because they should be back soon. So the Brobergs actually wait until Saturday. Jan was taken on Thursday. Remember that. They waited until Saturday to call the FBI, but she got a voicemail because the office was closed on the weekend, and they actually gave her a number on the voicemail that would redirect her to another number so she could call to get help. But Marianne decided not to call because she didn't want to make a big deal out of it. I don't understand why Marianne didn't want to make a big deal out of it, because your daughter is missing, Marianne. A grown man took your daughter, and you would listen to the wife of the man who took your daughter, instead of using your own judgment. That's your baby. And you have no idea where she is. Most likely this pause was from the intimacy Marianne had with B. That's really what B wanted. He wanted to make sure that they were like, okay, I'm not going to let you have any room to question anything I do because I'm going to make sure you trust me. And you know, I was intimate with you, so why would I ever be intimate with your daughter? Marianne was so trusting that she didn't view Jan being taken as an abduction. The FBI had to put it in her head that they're like, hey, you realize that this is kidnapping. Your daughter was kidnapped. They're not coming back. He kidnapped her. But thankfully, on October 22nd, 5 days after Jan was taken, Marianne did call the FBI that B took Jan. Gail was interviewed, and the FBI learned about B's motorhome and how it was not on B's property. The FBI later found B's staged car, and this led to the nationwide search of Jan and B. B took Jan to Mexico with the intention of marrying her, because the age of consent was 12 at the time. B used his son's birth certificate because Jan and his son were the same age in order to get her into Mexico. So let that sink in for a second. He has children the same age as Jan and around the same age as her sisters and younger. It's absolutely disgusting that a father is doing this. But this happens. And this wasn't B's first trip to Mexico either. So in some recordings that B made, he talked about Mexico and he talked about meeting several little girls where he picked out a few with fair skin and blue eyes, and he called the little girls, quote, the kind of little girls I could love, end quote. B supposedly had letters of recommendations from community members and tried to begin the adoption of a little girl named Rosa Maria. But border control wouldn't let him take the girl out of the country and returned her to her family, thankfully. So that did not work for him. But B was aware of what the age of consent was at the time, so little 12-year-olds could get married, so he was well aware of that. And when he was in Mexico with Jan, B started using more recordings from the aliens to manipulate Jan more. B gave Jan a book about reproduction and began to SAed Jan during this time. Also around this time, B called his brother, Joe, and instructed him to tell the Brobergs he wouldn't bring Jan back until they agreed to let him marry Jan. Thankfully, the Brobergs decline and Joe lets the FBI wiretap his phone. So the authorities trace Jan and B back to Mexico, and the Mexican law enforcement arrest both Jan and B. But get this, B's so manipulative that he bribed the guard with his gold wedding band for him to speak with Jan before they were sent back to the U.S. So he told Jan that she couldn't say anything about their trip and reminded her strict rules about what she could tell her family when she got home, and also brought up the fact that Jan was not allowed to speak to any male, even her father, or Karen would go blind, Susan would take her place, she would be vaporized, etc. That would happen to her. So she had to be quiet, or her family would face the consequences. And this is something that is so common with predators. When someone's abducted, they will threaten your family. They will threaten anyone that you care about, because that is the one way they know they can get you. Jan was returned home around November 23rd and still believed that she was half alien who needed to marry B so she could save the planet. But B was incarcerated as he was waiting for his trial, but as we've seen, B has to use manipulation tactics. So now he turns to his wife. Gail shows up at the Broberg house on Christmas Eve, telling the Brobergs to sign affidavits to agree that what happened was a misunderstanding and not an abduction, or she and B would expose Marianne's affair with her husband and Bob's encounter with B. And what do? They sign the affidavits. This is why I'm furious. You're choosing your reputation over your daughter's safety. That's disgusting. I get it. It was a different time. Everyone in this case keeps saying that. It was a different time. It was a different time. It was. But you cannot push a time frame for someone's negligence as a parent. These people were not protecting their child. It's no excuse. The Broberg parents were terrified of losing their reputation. I'm positive it has a lot to do with Bob more because of what he did and how sexuality was viewed back then. And also a lot of the infidelity, because that's a sin, and they didn't want their church to know. They didn't want to be kicked out of their own church. They wanted to keep their community and keep everything all hush-hush. But they chose to call off the kidnapping charges and keep their reputation.
A U.S. federal attorney called us, and he was livid. He said, "You can't do this. We are going to have a trial."
Berchtold was bound over for trial, but I don't have any witnesses all of a sudden. The Brobergs basically took the government's case and stomped on it.
So B was sentenced to serve 5 years, but it was dropped down to 45 days. But he only served 10 days in jail. And then he moved to Salt Lake City, Utah. The Brobergs were instructed to cut off all communication with B by an FBI agent, but they did not do so. They continued that communication. All through letters, phone calls, all of it. They kept it going when they could have stopped it. Disgustingly enough, Mary Ann's past intimate encounter with B stayed somehow in her mind, where she eventually starts having an affair with the man again who kidnapped her daughter. At this point in the case, Mary Ann didn't know all about the details of Jan's SA or the specifics of the brainwashing B forced onto her daughter, but details shouldn't matter. I don't care how manipulative, charming, and smooth-talking B was. At this point, Mary Ann makes me sick. How do you go and become intimate with a man who abducted your daughter, did disgusting things to her, wanted to marry her, and also threatened you and your husband with blackmail? It's absolutely insane. Mary Ann learned nothing. And in the Netflix documentary, she was speaking about her affair and how exciting it was because she was married to Bob for about 12 to 13 years at that point. With her body language and the way she was remembering the affair, it was showing that she had fond memories of the experience, even years later when she did know all the details with what was done to her daughter. I don't like the woman. She could have been somewhat redeemable, but she isn't. If the Brobergs stopped all contact with B and changed their phone number and protected their children from the predator, even after they chose not to move forward with B's charges, there could have been some hope. But not for Mary Ann. Mary Ann is an enabler and has completely failed her child. She goes against Bob. Bob stopped liking B around the time where his encounter happened. So to me, Bob is less of a problem. Mary Ann just kept stepping over Bob and doing things without his knowledge. Like when Jan was first kidnapped, she went behind Bob's back and told B that he could take Jan horseback riding when Bob already told B no. And Bob was getting pissed because Bob was like, well, who's her father? I'm her father. B is not her father. Why is he involved in this family like this? And Mary Ann is just like, well, I don't know. Well, I'm sorry, but he's just B. You know, it'll be fine. It's not fine. It's not. Mary Ann has said that she met up with B an estimate of 11 times for intimate acts, but I assume that it's probably more than that because of how long that affair had been going on. And Jan was exposed to the predator again because of Mary Ann's affair. So she interacted with B about 9 times or more, we're unsure, just because she was having that affair. Bob eventually found out about the affair, and he filed for divorce. And he took Jan, Karen, and Susan. I'm glad that Bob did decide to do this he was really starting to put his foot down and being more assertive, because I just felt like Bob was the one in the family who was always walked on. He was a little more reserved, and Marianne was the one who was always calling the shots. From what I've seen through the documentaries, through Jan's book, I just feel like Marianne thought she could run with everything. That, oh, it doesn't matter what Bob thinks, I'm just going to do what I want. But Bob didn't go through with the divorce because Marianne did break off the relationship with B. But this was most likely because of the events they went through together. So normally when people have a lot of traumatic experiences together, they feel like they have to stay together, because in the situation, it can often feel like no one else will understand you. That no one else is going to get this situation. Everyone else is going to be like, well, that's insane. And that really does happen. So they stayed together until Bob eventually passed away in November of 2018. During this time, Jan was actually becoming very distraught and desperate to marry B because she wanted to protect her family and save the planet. So Jan was really adamant to want to go marry B. And the Broberg parents were hesitant to keep Jan away from B. They were like, I don't really want you going. And Marianne's kind of, again, go ahead, Jan. Because she caves in. Every time anything's with B, she caves in and her knees buckle. And she's like, sure, go ahead. In the summer of 1976, B moves to Wyoming and he buys a family fun center there. So B and Jan are continuing through their phone calls and love letters like I mentioned before. So this communication could have been stopped and should have been stopped by the parents. They could have intercepted everything. They could have changed the phone number. They could have ripped up all the cards or letters and taken them from Jan before she could even get them. Anything to stop this communication. Jan was demanding that her parents allow her to go work with B at the Family Fun Center for the summer. So Jan worked on her parents and kept bringing up going to work with B until Marianne allowed it. Bob was furious. Bob was like, what? You let her go? You realize he took her, right? And Jan at this time was 13, almost 14 here. It infuriates me that the demands Jan was making were not shut down over and over again. And Jan was allowed to go by herself to Wyoming for 2 weeks to be manipulated by B again. She's a child. She's a baby. She should not be going to a different state by herself. Ever. But at this point, Jan did return home after those 2 weeks were up. And here is where we're going to stop for today. I will be posting a part 2 where we will start talking about the second abduction to make sure that no one is too confused. This is a lot to take in. This is a heavy case. If you like this video, please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time for part 2.